Thanks, Eric. Thanks to Abba. Do you say Abba with the I there? I've taken a path somewhat different than an academic career, and though I read the journals which this group publishes, for the most part I haven't had much association over the years. I was at the founding meeting back at MPA a little over 50 years ago, and I tell you, you can't turn around for even half a century, but you people are jumping all over the world. It's amazing. My retrospective is going to be very much like Ted's. I started on a journey to graduate education in 1958. In fact, I believe that the Azrin family and my family came to Carbondale, Illinois in approximately the same month. Or maybe he was a month earlier because he had to purchase a house, get settled. In the course of taking a course called Research Methods in the Behavioral Sciences, and as I was sitting in class that first day in September, a young fellow came in, introduced himself, wrote his name on the board. It was Nathan Azrin. And although it did not occur to me at the time, it couldn't, I didn't have the perspective. The course content very much is a metaphor to the road that I'm sure that Nate traveled in his eventually becoming the outstanding behavioral scientist and practitioner that he was. The course studied the classic social psychology and psychology studies which have been published, some of them group studies, some of them simply questionnaire studies. And in context, teaching the young students in that class the elemental processes of knowing something and really knowing it. You understand the experimental method, control groups, et cetera. The last thing that was introduced was a strange collection of papers called Symposium on Operationism that took place at Harvard. And you know probably, a number of you, that one of the papers given at that series of highfalutin, high theory meetings was a paper by Fred Skinner, where he talked about the ways of really doing research case history and scientific method. And to me, later it was clear that Nate had followed this path as a young social psychology student, in all-night sessions, having bumped into Og Lindsley, arguing about behaviorism, et cetera, having a chance to move over and see some behavioral work at Harvard, and then jumping in, feet first and forevermore. Well, another bit of recollection. When Nate invited the students of this class to visit the research lab if they liked, and I did so within, I think, a few weeks after the beginning of the class. And he showed me around a space just as Ted has described. It's, if you know what a 100-year-old state mental hospital ward looks like, this ward being an abandoned ward, 50 years of paint peeling off the ceilings, several day rooms, a whole series of smaller rooms where patients spent the evening and days too, in either seclusion or whatever. Heavy grids on the windows. This was, and when I first walked in, I remember so vividly finding my way there, told to go up on the second floor, and there was this pink 8.5 by 11 piece of paper scotch taped to the glass window in the door of the entrance to this old ward, and it said, of research lab. And so I talked with Dr. Essen at that time, Nate, he came to me, and he was in an unhappy mood. He'd been there a month and a half, and all that had come in for his efforts to get going with some research was a box of Ralph Gerbrand's cumulative recorder paper. He says, well, what do I need with the recorder paper? I don't have any recorders, I don't have any animals, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Over the next few months, I started working there on a volunteer basis. By Christmas, he had 2 rat boxes and a pigeon box going. Work in punishment for the most part. Work in the nice shop run by or manned by a quite competent technician who'd been trained in the Army. He was also working feverishly to try and improve the mechanical equipment in a variety of ways. Something that's always, that I've never been able to put in place with Nate. As best I know, Nate never showed a particular interest in hobbies or whatever with mechanical gadgets. Me, on the other hand, I was an engineer when I went down there, so that kind of stuff grabbed me. But it didn't stop Nate from asking the most basic questions and forcing the technologies to evolve so that they were more perfectly meshed with the questions he wanted to ask. I'm just stunned by this. And of course, he showed it in a variety of ways in the human work later. Well, all right, I need to move on rapidly here. Because I was a student in psychology, actually sponsored in the rehabilitation counseling program, I didn't think it was suitable that I do an animal study for my master's degree. And in fact, he encouraged me to take one of the old patient rooms and turn it into a test chamber, which with a struggle I did over the next some months. And by around the first of the year also, we're talking now just early 1959, I had a chamber which he thought might be adequate, and I began studying some severely ill male patients using cigarettes as a reinforcer. Worked well with some of these patients that were 3 and 4 bag, roll your own folks a day. And by the end of that next year, when I formally began the experiments, I got some orderly performance. I didn't know why I was doing that really, although I was reading feverishly at the time. It became clear that Nate loved Og Lindsley, but had some question about whether the Lindsley definition of psychosis, i.e. simply a pause in operant behavior, was a suitable functional analysis. And he pressed me to show that if you choose the reinforcers right, well, you get orderly and continuous behavior, which seems to subtend the times when these displays otherwise might take place. Something that, of course, Nate showed in grand style and in a living conditions setting to be the way to go. I went away in the late summer of '60 to do advanced work out east. And before I left, Bill Holtz showed up, told Nate he wanted to do a doctoral dissertation. And Nate, of course, by then had about 4 boxes clicking and clacking, that is their relays, in the control room, and had really done some nice work to perfect, if you'll pardon me. Apparently it's not politically correct. I'm distressed at this for no reason, but to be able to carefully and accurately deliver an aversive stimulus to a creature. Something that was not possible, really. That is, the inaccuracy and the variability was untenable in terms of any long-term understanding. Bill then began, after my departure, to do his studies with Nate on punishment. Just before I left, a chap by the name of Roger Ulrich came in and wanted to do his doctoral thesis. And Nate and Izzy Golddiamond had, with much frustration, been putting two rats in a box to try and replicate the Miller observations that you could, by turning shock off, reinforce attack behavior between this pair of animals. Something that seemed intuitively quite natural. But it was, I spent a dozen nights with Izzy and with Nate, just watching them tear their hair out, because these animals were fighting anyway. I remember Nate leaving their room and they fight anyway. They fight. Well, he was obviously in the midst of a paradigm which, when the shock occurred, caused the fighting, and when the shock then was contingently put in abeyance, reinforced such postures and continuance. And a paradigm, by the way, of the operant reinforcement of respondent aggression, which was much later put to formal examinations, some 6 or 8 years later. And Roger, Dr. Ulrich, took up these studies and did a nice job parametric examination of parameters. Well, I went out east for 2 years, and when I came back in '62, if I'm correct, Ted and I walked into the lab at virtually the same time. He was off like a rocket. He makes it sound like he did a bunch of animal research, but he had that lab clicking pretty good within a couple of months, if I remember. One of the richest personal parts of, and Ted has set the stage, of working with Nate, and in that setting, was that you were elbow to elbow many times a day, and you had fun talking about what was happening with each other's work. But there was also a precious, particularly in my later return time, where a group of us, to avoid all driving the 20 miles over this winding road, would pal up in a carpool situation. And although we solved a lot of the world's problems, we also did a whole bunch of planning for next research projects in that context also. When I came back, I don't know, I guess Nate liked the way I built that room or something, but he sent me off. He'd just been given permission to get more space. And so there was another abandoned lower level wing. Actually, you would call it a basement. It was half in the ground and half out. And so my first research project was to get to this much expanded space going. And I got him in trouble a couple of times because I kept gobbling up more space than the superintendent would really agree to, but it all worked out pretty good in the end. Don Hake, in the spring of '61, came out, said he wanted to do his doctoral thesis, and if you've read his work, he and Nate did some wonderful things, both with punishment paradigms, developing the primate paradigm for doing aversive control, and also doing some very subtle condition punishment and comparison of various reinforcement schedules of punishment. After the lab was hopping again, I dove into to more aggression work, and that was very fulfilling. It was just the richest time to have Ted and Don Hake and myself and Nate be able to spend the time talking together. I can't tell you how reinforcing in every sense that was. And it was the result that there was all of us in one way or another put out a very high rate. Nate was a giant among us, not perhaps in his first steps, but it is my absolute belief that 100 years from now, he will be accorded the same respect and admiration for his work in public health medicine that a listener or a pastor and a number of other behavioral people that have followed his footsteps. We're all very fortunate to have had Nate, and my whole career since then is a result of his work with me.